One task of the lobby for the rest of us, I believe, is to minimize the fears, both in Congress and among either this president or his successors, that having a little bit more balance, having a little bit more fairness, and having a lot more activity and active intervention in this conflict is not going to ruin your political career and ruin your life. So you're going to think, you're going to say, what am I going to say about Obama and Netanyahu? I mean, that would take a whole other address, and if C-SPAN wants to have me back, I'd be delighted to talk about that. So far, I like what I've seen. I think Obama has been brilliant because Obama understands, both because of how where he was raised and how in his political life in Chicago, and because he knows that there are groups like J Street and Amenu and Americans for Peace now out there, that there's a multiplicity of voices within the American Jewish community. And I don't think he's too worried about a major confrontation right now with AIPAC and the Israel right, or the pro-Israel American Jewish right. One of the other things I learned is that the thing AIPAC is most terrified of is a confrontation with an American president. And one of the reasons is what their livelihood and what their mission is to keep strong ties between Israel and the United States from one administration to the other. For that, they need access. Their staff needs access at the Pentagon and Foggy Bottom, the State Department, and at the White House. And of equal importance, their board needs access, because that's one of the perks. You give money to AIPAC, you get to sit in with that Assistant Secretary of State. So if there's a public feud, that's not going to help AIPAC very well. In addition, they don't want to, in this particular case, take on a wildly popular American president who got the support of the vast majority of American Jews. This is not a fight they're going to want to take on. What I've heard, and I hope some of them are watching and they can disabuse me of this notion, is that they're not going to go to bat for Netanyahu on the settlements. They might raise a stink about Iran, but not on the settlements issue. But eventually we're going to face the $25 billion question. Is Obama going to be ready to impose tangible costs on both sides if Israel doesn't change its policies or adhere to its promises? Or is the president going to return to his habits of ineffectual complaints? Now, to give him the leeway to do what he needs to do, passionate moderates like the organizations I just mentioned, and Christians and Muslims who basically agree with us, polls show, vast majority of whom support a two-state solution just like we do, we have a lot of work to do. How do we get there from here? The same mechanisms of influence employed by AIPAC and the rest of the conventional Israel lobby are available to the rest of us. The nucleus of the bloc within the American Jewish community already exists. I've named those organizations. The silent Jewish majority, whose views have not often been heard loudly enough, are starting to get heard in Congress, in the White House, and in the media. And not only that, but in recent years we've been joined by church groups like the Churches for Middle East Peace, or Arab American organizations like the Arab American Institute, or the Palestinian Task Force, American Task Force on Palestine, and a few others. And there is a slowly growing coalescence of groups that are passionate moderates, as I would describe them, that want to give Obama the leeway he needs to have to do what we think is the right thing. So finding more people to travel down this road is almost as tough as making peace in the Middle East. How are we going to do this? How are we going to build a domestic political bloc to make this happen? Because as I said, I'm not saying that the conventional Israel lobby lacks power. Of course, it has a daunting amount massive amount of power, just not quite as much as people might think. One of the reasons is to figure out where we've been all these years, the doves. Here's a quote. One of the most important tasks ahead is to overcome American Jews' deep-seated worries about the consequences of criticizing Israel. There is an entire generation of otherwise left-leaning Jews who could not bring themselves to ask Israel to compromise because of their fears of another Holocaust, and lingering guilt that they or their parents could not do anything to rescue the Jews of Europe. My friend Mark Rosenblum, this now quoted not from the book, tells a story in the book about he had a donor in Florida in the early 90s. Mark Rosenblum was the political director of Americans for Peace Now, and he calls that generation the guilt and gelt generation. He said this guy was way to the left on almost every issue, but not Israel. You know, we call it PEI, progressive except for Israel, because he remembered how his father had not lifted a finger to stop the Nazis. And he was not going to ask Israel to budge on anything. There was no way to stop it. Back to the book. Today, that generation and overt guilt about the Holocaust is fading. but Hitler is still routinely invoked by Jewish leaders in this country. The powerlessness of American Jews in the 1930s and 40s remains a powerful mobilizing tool. If I had $100 for every time Jews who argued in favor of talking to Arafat or Abbas or Hamas have been compared to Neville Chamberlain, I would have enough to be a major Jewish philanthropist. And more people would listen to me. The combination of Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon and, of course, Iran's reckless president and nuclear weapons program has provided plenty of ammunition for those who want to believe it's 1939, or whose organizations have a good reason to exist as long as it continues to be 1939. It's not 1939. It's very simple. It isn't. You can argue about the threats that an Iranian nuclear power would have on Israel, and that's very worrisome. You can argue about rockets coming into the coastal plain and not just Sderot from Gaza Strip or even the West Bank, and that's very worrisome. But it's not 1939. Israel is not going to disappear. So what do we do? What do we do with that logic? That fear, though, is an obstacle to the lobby for the rest of us, and it's a fear that you can tell I share to some extent. I don't think it's enough to justify not trying to give some modicum of justice to the Palestinian people and to preserve a two-state solution that both people want. There are other obstacles to the lobby for the rest of us. One of them is that, frankly, people on our side just don't care enough. Their side, the American Jewish right, the Hawks, think of this as their main issue. It's their mission in life. It's their passion. You can get them to come to Washington and lobby on whatever AIPAC wants them to lobby on because it's what they live for, to close the distance between the American government and Israel and to lobby for whatever happens to be on the agenda. Liberal American Jews tend to be not single-issue voters. We care about AIDS, and we care about preserving the social safety net, and we care about the free speech and lots of other things. And so we're less likely to think of this as the one thing we call our congressman about. I mean, I've seen that over and over again for the last 25 years. We try to get people who agree with me revved up on this, and they all say, yes, I absolutely agree with you. And you say, well, can you call Congressman Charlie Rangel, who happens to be my congressman? No. Because they love Charlie Rangel for everything else he does. And they're not going to yell at Charlie Rangel and say, we're not going to vote for you because you signed this resolution that AIPAC gave you. It's a real problem. I'm pointing out some of the obstacles. I'm not saying I have the solutions for them, but one of them is a simple, elemental sense of caring a lot more. Again, because this is in everyone's interest. This is in Israel's interests, this is in the interests of the Palestinian people, and it's in our interest. And I don't believe there's any contradiction between being pro-Israeli and pro-American and pro-Palestinian, because we all need the same solution. And those who believe that need to get off their duffs and do something about it. Another reason is the lack of clarity, and that's a tough one. Page 134. A related challenge has been the lack of easily justifiable, simple causes to rally around. This is a complicated business. The Jewish peace camp here in Israel has focused on demonstrating the necessity of compromise, but only if and when a reliable partner for peace can be found. It's difficult to mobilize on the basis of if and when. We've tried to garner support for maddeningly conditional, murky goals, Israeli politics that require leaps of faith, knowledge of the nuances, and a willingness to take calculated risk, e.g., trusting former terrorists to be neighbors. It's hard to ask people to get excited about the idea of an enduring peace when it's much easier to show them about the idea of an enduring, that there's absolutely no hope. And Israel's only recourse is grim, bloody conflict management. Quote, it's easier, Henry Siegman told me, a former chairman of the American Jewish Congress, to schrei Gewalt, to cry out one's woes, than to push for compromise. The right always has it easier because they can always be against something. This lack of clarity and easy answers in turn reinforces the natural tendency towards Me Tooism, a desire not to stray far from the conventional communal wisdom and risk ostracism. Why step outside the circle of wagons for the unpredictable shifting terrain of negotiated compromises and criticism of Israeli policies? Why step outside of it? I just told you, because Israelis and Palestinians and Americans need the American Jewish community to do so.